There is a little girl in Seattle who keeps a collection of treasures in a bead storage box on her dining room table. Each item is individually wrapped in a clear plastic bag, with a label showing exactly where and when it was found. A broken light bulb, a blue Lego piece, a small pearl-colored heart, a rusted screw labeled in her own handwriting, "Third favorite." She didn't buy any of these things. She didn't find them on the ground or trade for them at school. Every single one was left for her by a crow. Her name is Gabby Mann, and her story raises a question that scientists have been genuinely struggling to answer. When a crow leaves something behind for the person who feeds it, is that a gift? And if it is, what does that mean about the kind of creature a crow actually is? Most people don't think much about crows. They're common birds, they're loud, they're often associated with bad omens in folklore, and they have an unfortunate tendency to raid garbage. But over the last 2 decades, researchers have started paying very close attention to them, and what they found is quietly remarkable. Crows, along with other members of the corvid family, which includes ravens, magpies, and jays, are considered some of the most intelligent animals on the planet, genuinely rivaling apes and dolphins in certain cognitive tests. That alone is surprising enough. But the more interesting question isn't just how smart crows are, it's what they choose to do with that intelligence when they're around people. To understand the gift-giving behavior, you first need to understand how crows relate to humans in general. Researchers have found that crows can recognize and remember individual human faces, distinguishing between those linked to negative or positive experiences. This isn't a vague ability, it's precise and long-lasting. In one experiment led by Dr. John Marsloff at the University of Washington, researchers wore distinct rubber masks while trapping, banding, and releasing wild crows. Later, the crows exhibited aggressive behavior, scolding calls, dive bombing specifically toward individuals wearing the dangerous mask, even years after the initial encounter. They largely ignored those wearing neutral masks. Think about what that means. A crow that was briefly captured by a person wearing a particular face remembered that face for years and warned other crows about it too. Studies indicate that crows can remember specific faces associated with negative experiences for several years, potentially over a decade, the entire lifespan of the crow. So crows are not simply watching us the way a sparrow watches a sidewalk. They're building a file on us. They know who we are, they know what we've done, and they adjust their behavior accordingly. This is the foundation everything else rests on. Because what happens when a crow decides a person is safe? What happens when the file says, "This human feeds me, causes me no harm," and shows up consistently day after day? That's where the gifts come in. John Marsloff, a conservation ecologist at the University of Washington, first learned about the gifting behavior in the early 2000s while collecting stories for a book about crow intelligence. A man who had been feeding crows in his backyard for years told Marsloff that one day he found a candy heart perched on his bird feeder. Marsloff was initially skeptical, but couldn't find another reasonable explanation for how it got there. Since then, documented accounts have accumulated. Objects left by crows for humans include pieces of glass, buttons, paper clips, twigs, rocks, beads, coins, bottle caps, keys, earrings, and small pieces of food. The variety is strange. The pattern, though, is consistent. These objects almost always appear exactly where the feeding takes place, and they are almost always left for a specific person, not scattered randomly. Back in Seattle, Gabby Mann's story illustrates this pattern in unusual detail. It started when Gabby was 4 years old, initially dropping food by accident. The crows took notice, and by the time the daily feedings became a deliberate ritual, the birds started bringing her trinkets in return. Earrings, a hinge, a polished rock, a paperclip. Her all-time favorite gift is a small heart charm. Holding it up, she said simply, "It's showing me how much they love me." But then something happened that made the whole story harder to dismiss as coincidence. Gabby's mother, Lisa, lost a lens cap while photographing a bald eagle in a nearby alley. She didn't have to look for it. It was sitting on the edge of their bird bath. When she checked the bird camera, she could see a crow walking it into the yard and spending time rinsing it before leaving it there. The crow had returned something that belonged to her. Whether it understood the concept of ownership is a different question entirely, but it had observed her lose it, retrieved it, and brought it back to exactly the right place. So what is actually happening here? That's where scientists are more careful. The instinct is to call it gratitude. To imagine the crow thinking, "You've been kind to me, and I want to give you something in return." That interpretation feels natural to us. But researchers caution against it, not because it's impossible, but because it requires assuming that a crow experiences an emotion in the same way a human would. Gifting behavior could start out as an accident. Curious crows often fly off with an object, and then lose interest and leave it behind. If a crow happened to leave an object where a human put out food, and that human responded with excitement and more food, the crow would learn that leaving objects means a bigger meal. In other words, what looks like generosity might begin as a happy accident that gets reinforced by reward. Crows are exceptional at reading human behavior. As one researcher put it, crows are really watching us and are mindful of us, and in their own way, mining for the best way to interact with us. But there's a second explanation that sits alongside the first one, and it's more interesting. Crows exhibit what researchers call calculated reciprocity. They remember which individuals have helped or harmed them and adjust their behavior accordingly. They preferentially share resources with those who have shared with them in the past. This is behavior they show with other crows too. When crows trust one another, they exchange objects. They share food. They bring things back and forth. Young ravens and other corvids pass sticks, stones, and small objects back and forth to develop friendships. So when a crow brings something to a person who feeds it, it may simply be doing what comes naturally in its social world. It may be treating that human the way it would treat a trusted member of its own group. Mars Luff and his colleague Mark Miller studied crows and the people who feed them and found that crows and people form very personal relationships. As Mars Luff put it, there's definitely a two-way communication going on there. They understand each other's signals. The birds communicate through how they fly, how close they walk, and where they sit. The human learns their language, and the crows learn the feeder's patterns. It stops being a bird visiting a bird feeder. It becomes something closer to a relationship. The gifts, then, may be less about gratitude in the human sense and more about inclusion. The crow is not necessarily saying thank you. It may be saying something more like, "You are part of this. You belong to my group. Here's what members of my group do for one another." That is arguably more interesting than simple gratitude. Not every crow will do this. Not everyone who feeds and cares for wild crows receives gifts. Scientists are still learning exactly why some crows leave objects while others never do. Crows are individuals. Some are bolder. Some are more observant. Some form stronger social bonds with particular humans than others do. What does seem consistent is that it requires time and trust. Experts note that establishing a relationship with wild crows requires patience and consistency, regular feeding at the same time each day, maintaining a calm and predictable presence, and giving the birds enough time to decide whether you are safe. There's no shortcut. You cannot rush a crow into trusting you. Which brings us back to the original question. Do crows actually leave gifts for humans who feed them? Yes. The evidence is clear enough that even cautious scientists don't dispute that it happens. What remains genuinely uncertain is exactly why. Whether it starts as an accident and becomes a learned behavior, whether it reflects something closer to social bonding, whether it is a bit of both at once. But perhaps the most remarkable thing isn't the object left on the feeder, it's what has to happen before it gets there. A crow has to watch you, recognize your face, build a memory of who you are, decide, over months or years, that you can be trusted, and then, in its own way, act on that trust. A rusted screw, a pearl-colored heart, a lens cap returned to a bird bath. These things are small, but the intelligence and attention behind them is not.